But there in the last paragraph at the end of the book, it said, some new ideas are here needed. And so there I was. Some new ideas were needed. Okay, so I started to think of new ideas.
Well, I don't think there is any question about it. It can only be attributable to human error.
How does it help do that?
I don't know. I need to start my JJ practice.
You're the reason this species is a failure, and it makes me angry.
Welcome to Analytic Endeavors with Nick Thompson and Dr. Xander Malzoff. Thank you for joining us for the bleeped version of Analytic Endeavors. Instead of the classic bleep noise, we're going to use this sound. Oops, when we cuss. Thought it might be a little more entertaining than the classic beep. If it's annoying, maybe we'll change it for the next one, though. We're not married to it. All right, enjoy the show. Xander, we're here today to talk about Bill Nye, the Selective Science Guy. Why did we pick that specific title for this episode?
Well, we picked it because first, we were fans of Bill Nye growing up, and Selective Science Guy. We say that because he does say some stuff that is correct. He does say some stuff that's total
Oops.
So we just, as a scientist, being a you have to. You cannot be selective as a scientist. So it sort of goes even farther. Like calling someone a selective scientist is a big insult, I think, because it's sort of the antithesis of science. Science, you're agnostic to your political stuff and this and that. You're just trying to look at the data and the facts and the conclusions and how those are come about. So he doesn't do that. Yeah, I think the easiest thing to kind of do is look at some of the stuff that he said and kind of go through and sort of kind of have a counter narrative and just sort of correct. I mean, some of the stuff that he says is just scientifically just false. Like it's things equivalent to saying the earth is flat, kind of wrong levels of information. And it's sort of nitpicky, but it's also really important. Scientists are nitpicky, and these things are right and wrong. And we just kind of want to go through because these, it's important stuff, and I think it leads to some really interesting conversations about topics I think most people have heard about, but are not really as familiar with the details on. So yeah, I think most of these clips sort of surround right after, in 2013, the Fukushima reactor accident, right after the tsunami. They brought on Bill Nye to major news networks, and he went and just spouted off a bunch of nonsense. And it's sort of the same narrative that you hear. What he said is basically the same narrative you hear from a lot of people who are against nuclear science, and also seem to be on the left side of the political aisle. And this is where I find it. This is like the most troubling part. Is I would say in general, the left seems to be more, in favor of making changes to our policies to improve climate change, but then they're against nuclear power, which has the greatest, at the moment, ability to decrease our carbon footprint. So kind of, we'd like to bring these people, at least have them understand the science and be able to make a more informed opinion. So I think it's important to kind of go through and, with an objective mindset, knowing the science and engineering, and go through and kind of sort of check some of these facts that he's been touting as,
Yeah. We obviously have our own biases and opinions, and, you can listen to those episodes if you'd like to hear about those. But like Xander said, there is an objective, we can try to look at this objectively, even though we have our biases and opinions. And I think that's what we're trying to do today. And it's, our opinion that he's gone so far as to warrant saying Bill Nye, the Selective Science Guy. Our first clip comes from CNN, again, talking about the Fukushima plant. Yeah.
Bill, good to see you. Would a leaking reactor core, which we may be seeing here, would that be a major escalation of this disaster, or just simply another complication?
It's probably a major escalation. Now, if it's not the core that's cracked, it's some plumbing, some pipes that lead into it.
Yeah, so right off the bat, Bill, acknowledges, well, it could be the cracked core, or it could be some leaky pipes, and that's definitely a really big, bad problem. I mean, it's also a very vague response and not really answering the question either way, which at this point in time was really hard to do. But, see, a leaking core, it doesn't, what does that mean? There's the core, there's water inside of the core. Now that leaking is a problem for the operation of the plant. That doesn't mean that nuclear fuel will somehow be escaping. There's several layers of containment that protect the nuclear fuel from escaping to the environment. So leaking, water out of the reactor is a problem, but it's not like, this is going to be exposing the public to some high levels of radiation. Additionally, the leaking of some plumbing or some pipes, or, I'm sure he's not quite aware, there's a ton of plumbing and a ton of pipes in a nuclear facility, and most of it is moving around water that is used for, isn't radioactive, and then isn't, is like a secondary or a secondary system. There's multiple redundant systems, and if you in these reactor facilities, you can have small leaks. That's not, I think any large engineering system like this, is going to have leaks, and you can work the facility with leaks. Like saying a leak is, it's like saying on your car is about to blow up because it has a small oil leak. That's kind of the level of comparison he's saying, and it's like, no, that's just not true. I mean, now that I think it is crazy. Like, oh, some leaking pipes. That's probably a major escalation.
Right.
Like, it really is. Like, I mean, I know pipes leak at the nuclear facilities,
Right.
and it's mostly carrying around water.
Okay, so
there's so many, dude. If you see how many pipes at a nuclear facility, and you actually see how you don't see any water around, it's actually amazing.
Huh.
There's no, it's crazy. Like the amount of piping, I don't even know what it all does.
Just when you get this kind of radioactivity level going up so fast, it's probably plutonium. Now, this sounds like science fiction, and it kind of is. You transmute uranium into plutonium by giving it a jolt. You change some neutrons into protons, and it becomes fantastically radioactive.
So in that clip, right off the bat, Bill says, plutonium is what we're detecting, and that is why we think this is leaking, and that's what we're detecting first, which is sort of strange because plutonium is produced in a nuclear reactor, but it can't leave the nuclear fuel. So if there was a leak, a large leak, and you're detecting radioactive material, it would be from other, what's referred to as fission products, other things that are produced in the reactor that can escape out of the fuel, which isn't plutonium. So plutonium's too large. It can't escape the fuel, So he's just sort of, I think at this point he's fear-mongering and just bringing up one of the only things in a nuclear reactor people know about besides uranium. Oh, uranium, plutonium. That's scary. So I think this is fear-mongering, and it's also just not what you would be worried about. There are other things he could bring up that would be detectable if, a big leak was occurring.
Gotcha.
Because fresh nuclear fuel isn't dangerous. Like, Tori's handled fresh nuclear, like held it in her hand, like
right.
You can just hold it.
Right.
It's shipped on trucks.
It's just no
you've
big
probably
deal.
driven past it.
Right.
And also, Glenn Seaborg himself, a guy who won a Nobel Prize for creating plutonium, told me that it's toxic. It's very poisonous.
Yeah. So what is
so
it
if this
about
stuff gets into water?
What's the extra risk about plutonium?
It's just especially active chemically, and it's especially radioactive.
Bill here, furthermore tries to, establish his credibility by talking about how he's met Glenn Seaborg. He'll bring this up anytime you get anything about nuclear, like as if meeting Glenn Seaborg and Glenn Seaborg saying this is dangerous somehow makes him more credible. Like,
Bill, stop talking about Glenn Seaborg. All right, we get it. You met him. Cool.
Plutonium is dangerous. It's used in nuclear weapons. It's a concern, but it's in this situation, it's just ridiculous. It's not what you would be detecting. It's just, it's not what you'd be worried about in this kind of event. So it's just more fear mongering, and it's just sort of nonsensical. Like, I just don't understand, you can go and you can scare people quite well, I think, in this situation by just reporting the facts. And,
there was no need to go that far.
There's no need, and it's just sort of silly. Like, oh, I know Glenn Seaborg. Like, he told me it's chemically dangerous and toxic. Like, Yeah, I mean that like you don't need Glenn Seaborg to tell you that
Right.
to like understand that. It's not really.
Right.
I just think he brings up these like all the tidbits he can to give himself more credibility.
So this contamination, these radioactive particles suspended and carried and dissolved in the water could end up, who knows where. They could end up in the water in Tokyo. They could end up on farm fields. They can end up spreading all over the area where workers are trying to cool this thing off.
The plutonium's not leaving.
Right.
So
shut the fuck up, Bill. It's basically just conjecture about where something might go in space and time on the planet.
Right.
Like,
so is there any turning back here? I mean, can they go about in any way repairing this cracked containment vessel which houses the core?
Boy, I'm open-minded, of course, but I don't think you can repair a cracked vessel. Instead, you have to cement it. Maybe that is a repair. You have to seal it off in a irreversible way. You have to plug it up with concrete, and it's often mixed with a compound of borate. Boron also soaks up neutrons, and so this is what they did at Chernobyl in an extraordinary fashion with helicopters.
So here, Bill's talking about several different things kind of all at once here. He's talking about the containment vessel being breached. Now he's talking about the outermost structure housing the nuclear core. So this is a structure that's just meant to protect the public from any crack of the inside vessel and anything from there from getting out. So this is a concrete structure, very large. I'm talking about, maybe you can't repair it. Maybe you can repair it in an irreversible way, which is obviously how you pour concrete. So it just kind of sounds a bit.
That is how concrete
goofy.
works.
You pour it and then it's set. So not sure reversible concrete repair works, but anyhow. So the biggest problem I have with this whole line of thought right here from Bill is that he says, okay, you can maybe fix this concrete just like they did in Chernobyl, this is totally ridiculous. So Chernobyl was a really bad disaster because they didn't have a concrete, they didn't have a structure, so they built one. So he's saying this is like Chernobyl. It's not. They didn't even have a containment vessel. That's what was so insane about Chernobyl. Everyone else had these. They're expensive, but really hard to build. Super amazing piece of just engineering. Like you can crash a F-15 into a nuclear containment vessel, and it's designed to absorb that kind of impact. So it's an amazing structure. Russians were cheap. They didn't do it. In Japan, they have these, so it protected the public. Chernobyl, they didn't. So this is like fundamentally different. So he's comparing to Chernobyl at this point, which is just totally ridiculous. Like a crack versus building an entire structure, two completely different things, and just preposterous to like even compare the two.
But I think everybody here is hoping they can do it. Well, I am. Yeah, everybody remember that at Chernobyl, there's an area, if you think of an oval, about 100 miles long and 50 miles wide that you can't live in. Because this contamination got all over the place, this radioactive material.
This comparison from Chernobyl to Fukushima is just ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, I'm just focusing on like the fact that he's saying like the fixing of the containment in Chernobyl was the same as fixing of the containment in Fukushima. Like in one case, they had to build the whole structure at Chernobyl, and then in Japan, they were considering just fixing the containment.
So if I could boil it down a little bit. The Russians in the 80s with Chernobyl did not have a modern containment structure that every nuclear power plant today has, correct?
Correct. Okay. And all the ones that were built prior to the 80s in the United States as well all had this large, basically it's an additional structure that encapsulates everything that has radioactive material.
Right. Now, the Fukushima plant had one of these just like all modern plants. So for him to say, for him to equate the two is, what's a good analogy? The difference between buying a car with wheels and not? Like, I don't know.
I mean, I'm not sure even what the analogy is. he's saying, oh, they had to do the same thing in in Chernobyl
Right.
as they're gonna think about doing in Japan. Well, no, they built. There already was a structure in place in Japan. They just wanted to patch it up. At Chernobyl, they didn't have anything, so they wanted after the fact to build this structure around it to basically keep the melted fuel core at Chernobyl, from releasing any additional material to the public.
If Chernobyl had had a containment vessel like Fukushima plant, would there be such devastation?
No. I mean, I think that's the primary concern. What you had in Chernobyl, you had the core getting breached, and then there's nothing else to stop nuclear material from leaving the core. Whereas in Japan they had this whole structure, and also the fundamental disasters in each situation are so vastly different that it's sort of even hard to compare the two. But yeah, if there had been a containment structure like there was in Japan at Chernobyl, I don't think people would call the Chernobyl, disaster necessarily a disaster, and regard it in the same way they do now. I think it would have been a much
more minor failure.
Much more minor. I mean, it still would have been
bad, but not
bad, but it would not have caused the same spread of radioactive material as occurred in Chernobyl.
Which is what he's using as his excuse for comparing the two. So he's fundamentally
wrong. And
wrong.
we should also just quickly mention that the reactor at Chernobyl is very, very different than the reactor in Fukushima and the reactors used in the United States. So we can, we'll probably get into this at some point, but just talking about the differences between the two and sort of what happened at Chernobyl is like really, really interesting, and has actually been very well studied and quite well understood what happened, why it was poorly engineered, why the design is fundamentally flawed, and why comparing anything in the Japan or the United States to things that happened at Chernobyl is just sort of ludicrous.
And so as soon as you get leaks like this, and guys come out of there with apparently radiation sickness, something is cracked open and something is leaking. And everybody knows this, and I understand how much we all need energy.
Yeah.
But this stuff is fantastically dangerous.
Okay. Bill Nye, right here, comes out and says nuclear power is fantastically dangerous. Okay, let's just look at, this is very well studied area, and you can look at deaths from various power sources, and you can see in terms of energy usage, the number of people who have died from nuclear power is the same order as wind power. It's just not fantastically dangerous. It's just not. And this is why we're focusing so hard, is people think nuclear power is fantastically dangerous, when in fact I and many others, see nuclear power as preventing a huge amount of carbon from being put into the atmosphere, and all that carbon in the atmosphere and the climate change and the pollution from other sources of energy, which would be produced if nuclear power wasn't there, is far more dangerous than nuclear power. I mean, it's not even close. I mean, you can see, is wind power dangerous as coal and natural gas, and that's what he's trying to say about nuclear power, and it's just not. It's, in fact, I think, saved lives, and I think if people are serious about climate change and pollution, you need to be considering nuclear power as an option because of its ability to produce large amounts of electricity without all of this pollution. So we just really, just this point that he's making about fantastically dangerous is fear-mongering, and I think it comes from a certain political bias and not really looking at the facts of just the situation. Nuclear power is not perfect, but it is not fantastically dangerous, and I think that comment is just so hard to get around, and I just don't think it's scientifically accurate by any measure.
Yeah, Bill, because of the problems of the loss of power at the Daiichi nuclear facility, we're hearing about this substance called cesium, which has been released. What's the significance of that?
Well, cesium is used to slow and control the nuclear reaction, the fission of these very large atoms of uranium.
So this video here is, particularly egregious just because he's talking about cesium as being a neutron absorber and that they're detecting cesium. Cesium is not a neutron. I mean, it might absorb some neutrons, but it is not. He's thinking of cesium as boron, and right now when he's talking about cesium as being the thing that controls the reactor, 100% wrong. It's just 100% wrong. He's thinking of boron, which incidentally is funny because he brings up boron so many other times. Like anytime he can, he'll bring up boron, borax, borate.
Oops.
Talking about how everyone knows what boron is. And he's confusing cesium with boron. Like fundamentally, this is wrong. Cesium. Now, the detection of cesium after a nuclear event is a cause for concern because cesium is a fission product. It is a byproduct of the fission process within a reactor of this type. So he's right in that detecting cesium is a cause for concern, but it in no way controls the reactor.
And so when the cesium can't get in there to slow things down, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. Now, when things melt and you see that big cloud, what looks to me like dust and steam.
What? Okay, cesium can't get in there. Hold on, I'm just trying to like back out what the fuck he's trying to say. He has no fucking idea. This is like when I'm breaking it down and listening to it, the cesium does not get in. Like there's nothing that gets in there to stop. He doesn't even. This is like infinitely frustrating because this is like when you you stop it and listen to this. I mean, it's just not like there's no thing getting. It's not like there's something getting in there and that's what keeps the thing from like overheating. So in this situation right now, the reactor is off, and the only reason that the temperature is going up is because they're not running enough water through it to remove the heat, and the heat isn't coming from fission going on, it's coming from decay heat. So it's coming from fission products, which he doesn't understand clearly because he's talking about cesium as being the control mechanism when cesium is a fission product, and these fission products are what is generating the heat. So these are these byproducts like we've mentioned, and they're decaying because they're radioactive and they're giving off extra heat. So this is a problem with nuclear reactors in that you can shut them off, but you still have this heat left over from the fission products that are still in the fuel. So there's no thing that's getting in there. So to stop the reaction or to stop the reactor from melting, you need to be worried about cooling the reactor, and you can put borated water and stuff, but that's not the primary concern. The primary concern at this point for this reactor is to get more water onto it. That's what you are worried about, not getting some kind of cesium or some other thing over it. That's not what can. I mean, it's just so fundamentally such a big misunderstanding of how a reactor works. It's so many concepts kind of being divulged into one. It's just so nonsensical.
And then somebody reports that there's cesium in the air. If that report is true, that would indicate to me that the thing melted and exploded at some level or splattered into the air, driven by steam. Steam can carry things, can hold a lot of pressure. A steam engine, this is a steam turbine. It can carry a lot of energy and carry material, particularly particles, a long way.
Okay, I would like to say real quick that saying if this report is true and then talking about something is radically different than having an intelligent conversation about what might be consequences of actions. Like, does that make sense? Like,
yeah,
I think that to me is like really fundamentally wrong way. What he just did is a very fundamentally wrong way of doing journalism. And so he's really letting down journalism and scientists right there.
Yeah, it's really annoying because like, oh well, if this potentially happens, then this will happen. It's like, okay, I mean, yeah, we can go about that line of reasoning for basically any situation and make it sound like one of the worst things happening of all time.
Right.
Well, I mean, if there was a family of baby dolphins swimming in the pool, then they'd all die. Like, yes, I mean, these things.
Yeah, if that were the case, then yes, that would happen. But that's not been confirmed and ends up, in this case, being completely wrong. And yet he's going to spread fear in the public on CNN because of his fundamental misunderstanding of this technology.
Yeah, and it's I mean, it's just it's a little disappointing because this isn't secret stuff. This isn't complicated stuff. This is things that most undergraduate nuclear engineers understand. This isn't, and you can really break it down. I think most physics students, most people, you can kind of understand what's going on here. I mean, he's using cesium. I'm not sure if he just like mixed something up.
Yeah,
Just,
it's
most
clear.
people don't know what cesium is,
Right.
Most people aren't familiar. So it's like, okay, that maybe that does control a reactor. Like that's fine, but it doesn't.
Hmm.
So at this point, I mean, again, he's speculating here, and I think other people were, and they didn't. I don't think most people understand what exactly happened in the reactor at this point, but we know now what happened in this, and it's actually a pretty big area of research in the last 10 years. But the explosion that was shown here wasn't a steam driven explosion. It was actually a hydrogen gas explosion. So again, something to keep in mind with this Fukushima thing, just as sort of a side note, is that the explosion happened, it was a chemical explosion, not some kind of nuclear explosion. Now, it's not clear right off the bat why it's hydrogen, but it has to do with there is an interaction of the surrounding material and some of the fuel, and it actually produced hydrogen gas, and that was sort of a byproduct of the metals that they were using with outside of the nuclear fuel. So it produced this hydrogen gas, and eventually that built up, and then that's what actually ignited. So it was a chemical explosion in this case, having to do with the fact that they didn't have enough water to keep the thing cool, and and so that eventually melted some of this outer part of the fuel, and then and some of the interactions there, without getting it too detailed into it, produced a buildup of hydrogen gas, and that's what actually exploded because hydrogen's quite explosive, as most people know. So just keep in mind, he's talking about a steam-driven explosion. Like the steam, there isn't steam. Like this thing had been off for several days, and like he would have known. Like everyone knew that at this point. Like there's not steam built up over here. So like also that's just fundamentally kind of idiotic. So the thing had been off for several days.
But somebody's got to verify that cesium report to see if it's true. I read it at several other news agencies, but I haven't been able to verify it myself. And I also wonder if we can get space assets, weather-style satellites to have a look, and if those instruments can be tuned to detect cesium. With that said, it's a very, very serious situation, and it sounds to me it's somewhat more serious than people have announced.
Oh yeah, the space detectors, man. I don't know what the fuck he's talking. He's talking about space detectors. Okay, let me just listen. Hold on, we got to listen to this bit again. So right after 1:22, he's talking about getting the space assets. Okay, which like, I mean, just say satellites, man. Like we know what satellites are, like space assets. Talking about using that to detect cesium. Okay, like let's just like fundamental physics. Every physics student understands that an engineer, understands that radiation, the intensity of it, the detectability of it effectively decreases with the square of the distance. So you can think about, the square of the distance. Like if you're, very far away from a radioactive source, it's really hard to detect it, and it gets, more and more dangerous. If you're really close to it, it's going to be the most dangerous. You get even just slightly far away, like it gets less dangerous.
It's like an exponential thing, right? Like
it drops off very quickly.
Right.
Yeah. With the square of the distance. It's a very like fundamental. I mean, like
yeah,
just
I don't
dummy
think most
level.
people will understand like square of the distance, but if
yeah, so it's like okay, I think a good example of like a 1 over the distance squared law are magnets. Like most people know, like put two magnets near each other, like almost nothing happens, even when they're within, maybe a couple inches. But then get them really close, all of a sudden, and then you'll feel a force, either repulsive or attractive. Like, but it doesn't happen until you're like really close, assuming these aren't like insanely strong magnets. But like if you put them, a couple inches away, you'll feel nothing. Then all of a sudden you put them at one spot, then you'll feel them kind of, that force. So this is the same type of situation with radiation in terms of how intense you'll feel it. So like the notion that you detect, I mean, shoot, if you could detect cesium from space satellites, I mean, that would be some really cool technology. And it's just really hard because A, there's not that much cesium. B, it would have to transport all the way through the atmosphere and get to a satellite. And then you'd have to be able to distinguish that small amount of radiation from the natural background radiation, which would also be even greater than it is on Earth, up in the atmosphere, up in just in the upper atmosphere where these satellites are. So like this notion is just,
It
I'm not even like,
seems
why would you even bring that up? It's just so stupid.
right. It seems like he was trying to say like we could track the cloud of debris, even though like that's kind of suspect what that was, right? Like there is
Yeah,
both
I mean,
cesium in it,
you
and
could
he was wrong about all the fundamental things about it, but he might have been trying to say like, oh well, we could track
track the cloud.
the cloud
Right.
essentially from satellites. But again, that just highlights his fundamental lack of understanding of what we're talking about essentially.
Yeah, and maybe and satellites could track the cloud movement. That's not, that's fair, but I think he's talking about
No, yeah, oh, he's definitely
detecting.
not talking about that. I think that's what he would
Yeah,
say
because he
was
says
his excuse for
tuned.
talking about it.
Yeah, because he says tuned to detect cesium.
Oh, right. Yeah, no. It's
Yeah,
there.
so
There's
he's
no
talking
like
about
getting
using
around
the
it.
satellites as a radiation detector. I mean, I'm very, very skeptical that. I mean, I also don't know what kind of I mean, this is, I'm not sure what kind of radiation detectors are in space. I think that's a really hard problem. I mean, detecting cesium, isn't, I mean, near the ground, I mean, you can do it, but even so, like, you have to get fairly close to really see, like, the problem with the radiation is there's radiation everywhere. So, like, you have to be able to distinguish that from background. And so you usually have to get kind of close to be able to say with any kind of confidence that this is indeed. And things like cesium have characteristic uh, energies that you'll see when you're scanning the energy spectrum of radiation. But again, you need a lot of samples, so you need to be kind of close. Anyway, this notion of the satellites thing is just don't bring it up. You could have said it could track the clouds.
Right.
I don't understand. Like, man, like 1/r², man. Like, you're a scientist. Like, this is a basic concept. Like, something you should be explaining to like kids. Like, it's really important. Like, so many natural laws, like radiation and magnets, change over the distance squared, and it's just crazy.
All right, good point. Because for the skeptics who are out there, some people are saying, hey, they don't believe that they're getting the correct information or all of the information, especially about the readings from the Japanese officials. How much, I don't know, confidence can we put in those officials, or are we going to have to wait until the International Atomic Energy Agency and others get there to double and triple check those readings, Bill?
I suppose so. And in the meantime, I would approach with caution. Just to assert that things are under control when you see an explosion like that is unsettling.
Why is it inappropriate for Bill Nye to be speculating like he is on this topic at this point?
Well, I mean, I think speculation. I mean, it's exactly what speculation is. I mean, there's not really, he's just saying this looks scary, this is concerning, which are, somewhat fair things to say, but causing fear in this already traumatic event doesn't help anyone, and causing additional people to evacuate and to worry more isn't helpful. Like,
I think that
yeah,
that to me is where it actively crosses a line. Okay,
yeah,
like up until that point, he's wrong. Okay, we're all wrong. He's on live TV. Maybe we can forgive him, his many sins on his literal lack of understanding of this science, right? Okay, maybe we can do that. But when he starts using that mistaken knowledge to actively make people more upset and more worried and more fearful, that to me is where it crosses a line, and it makes me, have no qualms about saying, Bill Nye, the selective science guy. Like, you shouldn't be doing that, dude. You even if you understand the science 100%, if you hadn't made a mistake, you shouldn't be doing that at this stage in a disaster like that.
I know for a fact that, in the U.S. that they know if they were to evacuate this plant, like it's, full emergency, and they're evacuating this zone within some number of miles around the plant, they know people will die from the evacuation process. So it's really a last resort, because they know people will die from the evacuation. Like, it's planned into the licensing and the siting analysis that they do at nuclear plants in the United States. Like, I know this because
Oops.
my girlfriend worked at a plant, and they knew, if they were ever to trigger this X alarm, that, for the full evacuation, it, statistically, a small percentage of people are going to die from, stress or, car accident or some part of the evacuation process. So this is something that's very well known.
Now, at 3 Mile Island, TMI, as they whimsically refer to it, there was a small release of radioactive gas and steam. My recollection is of steam. And that was not good, but quite well managed, all things considered. There was a lot of trouble bringing the plant back online, but it's working today. This thing sounds way more serious. I mean, that wasn't a small release of material. That was a big deal.
The exposure that you could really see, and the exposure that people got, the dose that they got from this in this Fukushima one was very small, and like in 3 Mile Island, it was the equivalent to some number of X-rays, and but the evacuation process, several X-rays won't kill you, but the evacuation definitely can. So I mean, I'm not going to say in every situation it's not good to evacuate. Like, there's a reason why they're saying to evacuate, but they do know that it's really, they don't want to do it prematurely. They don't want to incite additional fear.
Now, the other thing I understand they're pouring in is boron or borates. Now, boron is another material used to, especially a certain isotope, boron-10, is used to absorb neutrons and slow these reactions down. But I gotta say, that is a pretty doggone extreme thing to be doing, to be pouring some boron-bearing material, like you've heard of borax.
Yeah.
Or so that's pretty. I'm not sure how well that would work when you have steam roiling up and the flow of very high temperature fluids around. I'm not sure how effective that would be, but they must have had the stuff on hand.
It's interesting that actually, I forgot how many miles down the way, but at the plant, at the Fukushima plant, they didn't build the flood walls high enough. But then there was on a similar nuclear project down the way where the tsunami also hit, they built the flood walls, I think, 4 times higher, and that plant, wasn't even had no problems. I think from what I call, because some engineer just said, like, no, we're gonna do this anyway, like.
Interesting.
Like, so, there's like several engineering reasons why the nuclear plant at Fukushima did well. Like, I mean, everything worked, all the safety systems worked. So like, the fundamental problem was like the very last safety systems at the Fukushima plant failed and they failed because they basically at the end they lost offsite power, so they needed to basically run the pumps to put more water over the fuel to remove the decay heat.
Right.
Because the reactor is off. It's been off for several days, but there's still heat there that needs to be removed. And normally they have power. They weren't expecting to lose power for so many days, so they have backup generators. But those backup generators had problems because they themselves got flooded because they built them at the same level as the plant, which was dumb.
So is that can you say definitively that that wouldn't be allowed to happen in America? Like, do we have standards to avoid that kind of thing?
I think most people here, I mean, there's
because
plants.
There's so few plants left in America, right? Like,
well, there's 53.
Are there that many
plants? Maybe a couple. I'm it's in the 50s, and most of those plants have 2 reactors at them. So there's like around 100 reactors running in the United States.
Gotcha.
Yeah. That number, I'm plus or minus a couple on that, on both those numbers.
Okay,
But
just a
that's
real quick
rough.
Wikipedia: nuclear power in the United States is provided by 98 commercial
98.
reactors
Yeah.
with a net capacity of 100,000 megawatts, give or take. So yeah, like 100
Yeah,
reactors
but
and 50-ish sites. So.
to answer your question, I mean, my understanding is the reactors that are on the coast, like the ones in Florida, like Diablo Canyon in California, like some of the other ones on the eastern coast, they have, I think the one I know most about is in Port St. Lucie, and it could withstand, category, higher than Category 5 hurricanes, and it has, and or not has, but it's seen Category 5-ish hurricanes, and it can have 40-foot high floods. But they don't put the generators at the same spot. Additionally, in the United States, after this process, so this is pretty interesting. The nuclear fleet in the United States, there was this plan. The name is escaping me of what they called it, but they basically made another redundant system, more generators, and they have this team that's on standby 24 hours, 365 days a year that can make it to any plant in the United States with more generators and more people to get additional cooling water on the reactors for additional days. If for some reason you lose offsite power for more than 3 days, your generators run out of fuel, then there's this team that will be there at, within a day that will provide a fifth level of cooling option. And there's a name for this. Wow. I should look it up. But this was a thing. It was, a couple $1 billion investment by the nuclear fleet. And they, here this is an interesting, I should mention this too, just regarding safety culture. We're comparing the United States to Japan and this and that. And Japan has like really amazing engineers, but their safety culture is a little bit different. And this is, somewhat anecdotal, but I was talking to folks at this plant down in Florida, and they actually had some people from the Japanese nuclear, one of the plants, and they came down and they watched one of the safety drills that they were doing at this St. Lucie plant, and they were stunned because the safety drills at the plants that we do here, they're not, the scenario that they simulate isn't planned. And the people in Japan are like, what do you mean it wasn't, like, you didn't tell them what scenario you're going to do? And everyone in the US was like, that's not the point of a safety emergency drill. Right. Like, they're not supposed to know. But in Japan, they were always doing these drills where they kind of knew what was coming, so they weren't really drills. So
oh wow,
it's kind of like, because they didn't want to look bad when they were doing these drills,
right.
So they kind of had this. So they're sort of stunned, like, oh wow, like you guys are doing, like, they really don't know what's going on, like you really could, mess up, But that's, so to me, there's like a kind of a difference in culture in terms of how safety is approached, and definitely that's like anecdotal, but just sort of an interesting tidbit from like a recent experience with folks from Japan. It was sort of interesting and just sort of stunning, actually. And you can kind of see how that would come into play. I mean, I think here we have a really, really high standard of safety at these plants, and really high, like the culture is really good around it. Like, it's not a place where there's not a lot of joking about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think as great as The Simpsons is as a TV show, I think it did really influence how people thought of a nuclear reactor and plant, and like how it operated and what went on in there, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's true. And then I also kind of look at it like, man, I mean, this is a pretty amazing thing that someone as dumb as Homer Simpson could be running, in some magical world, in like a room by himself controlling the reactor, which is like not how it happens at all. But it's, right. I mean, the thing is engineered in a pretty amazing way, and it, will, shut itself down. Someone like Homer Simpson can run it.
Gotcha.
I mean, it's interesting. It's the highest paying job that you don't need a bachelor's
college degree for.
Yeah, you don't
right?
need a college degree, and and not to say it's all the engineering. Like, you have to become a nuclear reactor operator is super hard, and you have to work really hard. But it's not like you have to be some kind of genius scientist or have a background in science. Like, you can just, understand how it works and then, learn how to fix it. But it's just kind of a cool tidbit that it's, one of the kind of last really nice blue collar jobs that's out there.
Okay, so this is our third clip of Bill Nye the Science Guy. This clip comes from a program called The Eyes of Nye that was produced in 2004, I believe, and was funded by PBS and a couple other things. Right. So the Eyes of Nye was kind of it was his reboot before his Netflix reboot. He kind of tried to come back. He wanted to make a little bit more adult show. It is in the description. It says it is aimed for adults and teenagers more so than children. It does also say, though, that all episodes were rated TVG, except for 2 of them, which we're not talking about today. And I think that is important to mention. Maybe I have a different perspective now that I have kids, but anytime I see a TVG or G-rated movie, I think, you know what, it's probably going to be okay. Like, I'm not going to have to worry about, overly serious themes or that kind of thing. So I think it is important to point that out. And Bill Nye is the co-writer / producer / a couple other things on this. So it cannot be said that this was done, the writers had an idea and he just said it. It can't be said that he didn't know what he was saying. This is his product. So anyone that wants to say, oh, he didn't mean that. No, that's your argument is invalid. He meant to say everything in these clips. So with that, we'd like to play this first little chunk. We are skipping the first about a minute. It's supposed to be entertaining little skit. Doesn't really have anything to do with what we're talking about. You can watch the whole episode. It's 25 minutes long, 25 and a half. You can watch the whole thing if you like. We're just going to talk about the sections that we want to talk about, and we're going to gloss over some of the other.
Now, the persistent paradox that is nuclear power. It's efficient. One train car full of nuclear fuel can keep a nuclear power plant running for a year. But it takes a whole train load of coal every day to keep a conventional power plant running. There are a lot of things to be afraid of when it comes to nuclear power. There are meltdowns where the uranium metal fuel gets so hot that it burns a hole through the reactor and the whole thing explodes.
Okay, so Xander, he says that uranium metal fuel can get so hot that it burns through the reactor, I believe he says, to cause an explosion. For those of us not initiated, what's wrong with that statement?
Well, the first thing he says, uranium metal fuel. And uranium metal fuel has been used in research facilities, but uranium metal fuel is not what is used in commercial nuclear facilities. And it's a difference, but it's big. It's uranium, it's a ceramic-based fuel, which, to scientists actually is very important. So right off the bat, it's like he didn't even, do the cursory Google search. What is nuclear fuel? Well, you look it up. It's uranium oxide, and it's a ceramic, which is different than a uranium metal fuel. And so he's saying, next thing he says, melts down and it explodes. What does that mean? I mean, we have several examples where, the things melt down and they do not just explode. Like, reactors do not just spontaneously explode. There's, even if they're melted, they're not going to explode. Now, this might be confusing because we have seen Chernobyl and Fukushima. There have been explosions in the reactor, but they were not, first of all, they were not a nuclear explosion. They were side effects of different reactions of the materials within the reactor, in the case specifically of Fukushima, producing hydrogen gas, and it was a hydrogen gas explosion. So in all exploding reactor cases, it has been chemical explosions caused by basically interactions of the materials within the reactor, without getting into it. So to say that nuclear fuel melts and then it causes an explosion just isn't correct.
It could be the heat source for an explosion, right? But it's not an explosive material on its own, correct? Or am I wrong?
Correct. Yeah, like, you're not going to make a nuclear explosion, like something like a nuclear bomb explosion, from melted nuclear fuel. in a commercial facility. It's just not possible.
Gotcha. It's a completely different. Is it a chemical process, or I mean, what's the term there?
So in
Or is
Fukushima,
that too much?
well, I mean, I would just say I'm just going to focus on Fukushima because
Mhm.
it's the most recent one and the one I know a bit more
Well,
about.
probably the most studied in the free world too. I mean, we don't.
Most studied, yeah. And basically what happened is you got the nuclear fuel didn't melt, and the zirconium cladding, the basically there's a container around the nuclear fuel, and that got hot and interacted with water, and basically there's an oxidation occurred and produced hydrogen gas.
Gotcha.
Basically, like the takeaway is there's zirconium, nuclear fuel, and some other stuff within the reactor that was hot enough that made that created a bunch of hydrogen gas that eventually exploded. And I would just mention, like at 3 Mile Island, part of the core melted and there was no explosion. We actually have, this is interesting to bring. I didn't actually occur to me until just now, but we have melted fuel in controlled ways with no explosions. You actually have videos of this. There's a facility out in Idaho where they basically simulate accident scenarios of fuel in a test reactor. So they actually have melted lots of fuel in this reactor in a contained structure. Again, no explosion because the act of melting the fuel does not cause an explosion.
Gotcha.
That's, I think, the fundamental takeaway is he makes this claim: fuel melted, explosion. Which is just
that is
true.
not an A to B equation.
No, it's a very complex, and I would say, since Fukushima happened, I sort of mentioned very quickly, it was this part of the problem was the cladding, the surrounding material of the actual fuel. One of the barriers to prevent fission products from leaving the fuel was made out of zirconium, and the reaction of the zirconium helped produce the hydrogen gas. So they actually have made other claddings without zirconium to prevent this kind of hydrogen gas production from occurring. So
okay.
Yeah, that's been a big initiative in the last 10 years to basically this accident tolerant fuel.
Gotcha.
So they're also changing the fuel slightly to some other uranium carbide, some other types of fuel that aren't susceptible to this problem.
Gotcha. Okay.
Which, yeah. So again, I think you nailed it. It's not an A to B process, meltdown to explosion. There's many steps in between.
Okay, so we're gonna go to this next clip from Bill.
There are terrorists who could get hold of some of this nuclear material and make the events of September 11th look like getting a parking ticket.
Okay, in that clip there, Bill says that terrorists could use nuclear fuel and make 9/11 look like nothing, or something along those lines. This is the first part of this episode that I kind of said, whoa. I don't know nothing about anything, but that seems really irresponsible to say. So after hearing that, Zaner and I had a few conversations, multiple conversations actually, and this is the one that I would really like to button down on personally. I think it's really easy to say these kind of things. Oh yeah, terrorists could get this and have a horrific terrorist attack. Okay, it's very easy to say that, but what does he actually mean by that? Well, first of all, he goes another kind of A to B equation where it's terrorists get nuclear fuel and then there's a terrorist attack that makes 9/11 look like nothing. Okay. So I had Zaner break this down for me a couple times actually. It's a pretty heady topic. But in our discussions, I think we've kind of boiled it down to kind of the easiest way to understand this. So first of all, Bill says that there's kind of a two-step process, right? Terrorists get the fuel, and then there's a terrorist attack. To kind of give him the benefit of the doubt and say, well, this is probably what he meant to say, we've kind of gone through and revised it to 4 basic steps, kind of. And that would be terrorists get the used fuel, actually, possess it somehow. Then they would need to process it. Then they would need to have a delivery system, meaning like a missile or a plane, something like that. And then they would actually need to deliver it. Okay, so those are our kind of 4 steps, what we think Bill meant to say. Okay, so the first step of that, to go back, is terrorists get nuclear fuel.
Yeah, so I think kind of focus on this first step. How would some organization, get nuclear fuel that's not supposed to get it? Use nuclear fuel specifically.
Right.
I think that's, first that's really
kind of step one.
Step one.
Right.
And maybe one of the hardest parts of the whole this whole operation here. Now, I would say this, first of all, I'm not an expert on all of the details of nuclear power plant security, and in fact, some of the details aren't even made clear to it's classified
it's
and
secret, right?
are only made clear. Yeah, in some way.
Or
I think at least like the plans. Yeah, there's like classified reports. Like there's public reports on nuclear facility security, and we'll have some references to those and some links. But then they even mentioned the details of the exact security configuration are classified for somewhat obvious reasons.
Right.
But okay, so you have to steal used nuclear fuel.
Right. So that's the goal. So we kind of identified two-ish ways to do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can take the fuel. So the fuel is stored in this used fuel is stored in two spots in a nuclear facility. There is a fuel pool that is inside of the nuclear facility that's stored there right after it comes out of the reactor. They put it in a pool for it to cool down and for some of the radioactive material to decay away so that it can be handled a little bit easier.
Right. It's extremely
stored there
hot,
for a couple of years.
Very difficult to even obviously handle. Like no person would handle it, but it's logistically hard to handle this stuff even with machinery and stuff, right?
Right. So it's in this big pool. It's very deep. You need a special crane. You need to be able to get into this facility, and then you actually have to look at a camera to organize, with several people to then go in and use this crane to actually grab if you wanted to pull it out of the pool, it's
right.
It's difficult to pull out. And then once it's pulled out, it's extremely radioactive. So you have to pull it out, and you have to put it into something and then take it away. Right. So that's one.
So I think we kind of identified two ways, so we were going to kind of go through. Oh, I'm sorry, Zander, do you want to say something?
Oh, I was going to say I don't know if we want to mention this, the other spot that nuclear fuel is stored, yes, which is in the dry cask storage. So after it's been in the spent fuel pool for several years, they then put it into a giant concrete and
steel
cylinder, effectively.
Right.
Yeah, there's steel and actually wood and some other stuff inside of it. These giant concrete cylinders where they put several
30
fuel
inches
bundles.
Thick wall type thing.
Yeah,
and just to
very
mention,
very thick.
We looked it up, and the high end they weigh 360,000 pounds, and at the low end they weigh about 240,000 pounds. Okay.
Yeah, and we'll revisit that weight issue on trying to just move these things just in a moment, I think.
So we kind of hypothesized if we were going to go with Bill Nye's hair on fire kind of statement, that they would either have to do, a terrorist organization would either have to do some kind of ground assault or crash a plane into the either dry cask storage or the facility and somehow hit the exact right spot in the pool, all this stuff. Okay.
And this pool isn't just outside like a swimming pool.
Right. It's also deep. I mean, it's next to the reactor, right? Because you take out the fuel and put it right in there, generally, right?
Typically, you're right.
Okay. So it's deep in a facility that has been, most modern facilities, or maybe all, I don't know, have been rated to withstand insane amounts of damage, like 747s crashing directly into them. And still not being able to penetrate to where the actual fuel is. So can we just go ahead and say that that's not going to happen?
Yeah, I just think of all the targets, if some they're going to go through the trouble of stealing the largest plane they can, terrorists. I think when they look at terrorist attacks and they try and any kind of risky situation, what's the probability of success? Terrorist groups, from the studies that people have done, they want something with a high probability of success.
Mm-hmm.
And they look at these facilities and the probability of, what do you want to do when you attack a nuclear facility? The amount of people there isn't very much.
Mm-hmm.
It's, so you're not going to kill a lot of people. And the way you would, I would imagine they'd want to, inflict the most harm is by releasing, radiation from the fuel, and just the psychological impact as well.
Right.
But so you'd have to penetrate the fuel and release that into the environment, and just the success rate of that is just so low.
Right. Not to mention they'd have to get this plane. I would assume that they would have to hijack or steal it somehow, through some nefarious means. In which case, there's going to be 60 different federal agencies looking for them. There's all these logistical things that would make it extremely difficult for that to happen, right?
Right.
I think
That's
anyway.
yeah. I mean, I think that's just the general, like, the chance of success is just extremely low of all the facilities you're going to attack once you've gone through the trouble of stealing a plane. That this one just doesn't make as much sense just to even try. And then also, it's one of the only facilities where this has actually been explicitly thought of for a long time.
Right, exactly.
So it's
they're
sort of interesting.
designed to hold up to that kind of damage.
Right.
Right.
But I mean, if you just look at like critical infrastructure you'd want to attack for, like, I just, it just makes less sense.
Right.
Again, this is sort of like hypothetical sort of brain trust sort of thinking about these problems, but I think it's just important just to kind of.
Well, and yeah, I mean, we're kind of responding to his hypothetical too. So, I mean, we are kind of doing this hypothetically because it hasn't happened yet. And we're kind of telling you why it's not really feasible to happen. So the one method would be crashing a plane into the plant, which, as we just said, is rated to withstand that kind of damage, and the logistics of actually getting the plane would be extremely difficult, or a ground assault, which,